Imagine waking up one morning as a relatively unknown drummer, and by that same evening, you were on board a plane with arguably the biggest band in the world. Before you know it, you're rubbing shoulders with the likes of Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and John Lennon, and you are indeed descending the steps of that airplane to hordes of screaming fans, the same fans you'd be playing to that very night. Well, just as quickly as this fame has chanced upon you, it's quickly taken away. And before you know it, you are waiting in an airport lounge for a flight to take you back to Britain. This indeed is a story that's true, based on one Jimmie Nicol, who indeed did play drums for the Beatles at one point in their career. So come with me if you will, and let's have a look and see how Jimmy did indeed chance upon this job, this once in a lifetime experience of being the official drummer for the Beatles. Before his brush with immortality, Jimmie Nicol was just another hard working drummer in London. Now, born in 1939 in London, Jim was actually obsessed with music, and by the time he was a teenager, he was playing professionally, working dance halls and jazz gigs, and being a session musician, even working with some of the biggest names of the day, such as Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. Now, on one of these recording sessions, Jim was tasked to play drums, recording some cover versions of Beatles hits for an album entitled Beatlemania. At the time, he probably thought it was just another paycheck. But that small connection would change Jim's life for a brief moment in time in June in 1964. Now, the only option that they could really come up with at this time was they needed a replacement drummer. Somebody who knew the Beatles songs, somebody who was reliable, somebody who was quick to learn, somebody who could fit in quite well with the band. And so they landed upon Jimmie Nicol, who indeed ticked all of those boxes, which was making the tour even more viable to carry on. He was contacted with almost no warning and was told just hours before the flight that he'd got the job. Just imagine that for a second. One minute you're a session drummer, the next you're being contacted and asked to join the Beatles on their world tour. Jimmie Nicol was rushed to rehearsals and rapidly practiced with the band before they headed out on their world tour. Their first stop was in Copenhagen, and Jimmy was quickly introduced to the reality of Beatlemania, and the band were confronted by thousands of screaming fans upon their arrival. And then they hit Denmark. Same chaos. And then Hong Kong. And yes, even there, Beatlemania was in full swing. And then, of course, they came to Australia. When the Beatles arrived in Adelaide, there were estimated to be 300,000 fans waiting for them. That is nearly a third of the actual city at that particular time. Yes, all waiting to see the phenomena that was the Beatles. And in the middle of all of this, of course, there was Jimmie Nicol. So here was Jimmie Nicol living an experience beyond his wildest dreams. This is a man who days earlier almost nobody knew about. And suddenly He was living an incredibly insane celebrity experience, staying in luxury hotels, riding in limousines, playing sold out shows with the biggest band in the world, and getting mobbed by fans, and even reporters wanted to get an interview with Jimmy. In fact, in one press conference, Jimmy was asked how he was coping with things, and he just happened to say, "It's getting better all the time." Now, did that influence a later song on the Sergeant Pepper's album? I know not. But for 13 days, Jimmie Nicol was living someone else's dream. Things, of course, were far more complicated than they appeared. For all intents and purposes, Jimmy was indeed a hired hand, a substitute. And although John Lennon joked around with him, there wasn't that brotherhood that the Beatles had as the four guys that they were, who'd spent so much time, in each other's company. So it made things slightly awkward, of course. But Jimmy knew that the inevitable was bound to happen, and indeed it did. And Ringo Starr returned to the fold, joining the band in Melbourne. And then reports suggest that Jimmie Nicol received a check for his work. He took some photographs, shook hands, and then was sent home to the UK, obviously by plane. So Jimmy's career ended just like that. There was no fanfare, no encore. Literally a man who was sent to wait for his plane in the airport, and the whole experience, the dream, the fantasy that he'd experienced over those few days had all come to an end. How he would have handled that, I do not know, but it couldn't have been easy. At first, of course, people assumed Jimmy would become a star. Why wouldn't he? This guy had just played with the Beatles. But fame is strange, and especially fame that is fleeting. He did try to capitalise on his sudden recognition. Why wouldn't you? He joined bands, started projects of his own, released music. One of his bands after the experience of the Beatles was the Shub-Dubs, though none achieved major success. And the public moved on very quickly. They do. Because they didn't want the other drummer. They wanted, of course, Ringo Starr. And by the late 1960s, Jimmy's career sadly was in decline, and financial struggles followed him too. And then something even stranger happened. He just disappeared. Jimmie Nicol largely disappeared from the public eye. There were reports that he'd moved over to Mexico and then returned back to the UK, and occasionally journalists would try and track him down to no avail. Even Beatles historians had trouble locating him, and they're pretty good at locating most things Beatle related. Eventually, a reporter did track him down, and when asked about his experience with the Beatles, Nicol could only say the spotlight was strange. And to be honest, that's probably quite a relatable thing to say when you consider that he'd been with the band at the peak of their career, on the road, travelling the world, Beatlemania in full swing, and suddenly, from those dizzying heights, he was back to anonymity, living a normal life. Now that's got to mess with anybody's head. On a quick note about Jimmie Nicol, apparently, rumour has it that Jimmy's son was working on the anthology series back in the day, and Paul McCartney had actually asked his son if he could make contact with Jimmie Nicol to obviously catch up, see how he's doing, and I think the firm response was a no. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Anyway, if you've enjoyed watching this and learning about little obscure bits and pieces of music history, Please consider subscribing and, of course, hit that like button. And as always, I'll see you on the next one.